My name is Christopher Peacock. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures here at Columbia University. And my work is primarily on contemporary Tibetan literature in the People's Republic of China and the relationship between modern Tibetan writers and the central ideas in Chinese literature. And I have also recently translated a book by an author called Tsering Döndrup, and this is coming out with Columbia University Press next January, and is also part of the Weatherhead Books on Asia series. And the reason I actually came to start translating this book is because it was very much related to my work. I had a whole chapter of my dissertation specifically about one of Tsering Döndrup's short stories. And so I translated this story just for my own use. And through my contacts with the author, he then suggested that I keep working and translate more, and it gradually snowballed and became this big project. He is one of the most prominent, one of the most well-respected authors of modern Tibetan literature. And this is something we would generally say began in the early 1980s as a field, the idea of modern Tibetan writing. The story that I began with is called Ralo. It's one of the most famous pieces of Tibetan literature. And it's about this hapless nomad who just faces failure after failure after failure in his life. And the reason it was of interest to me, that it was significant to me, is because Tibetan critics, Tibetan intellectuals, compared this story to the true story of A.Q., which is one of the most famous pieces of modern Chinese literature by Lu Xun. And without going into too much detail on that, there's a big debate about whether or not this character, Ralo, is a representation of all that is wrong with Tibetan society, with Tibetan civilization. And so that's where I began, but it veered off in this other direction. I got very interested in his work in general, which is fascinating. It's very funny, it's very satirical, but it's also very dark. It can be very violent, very serious. A lot of his stories are about major problems in Tibetan society today. He writes a lot about gambling problems, about alcoholism, addiction, prostitution. And he's also a very fierce critic of what you might call institutional corruption. So he's very critical of religion, of Tibetan Buddhism, but only the corruption of it when it's practiced poorly or used to exploit people. And in the same way, he's very critical of official corruption, so corruption among the Chinese bureaucracy. And overall, he comes from a nomadic area in Qinghai, and he's more than anything interested in the lives of ordinary people, ordinary Tibetan nomads. And all this fiction is actually set in a fictional county called Tsering, which resembles the place he's from. And this is the world in which all of his writing takes place. And one last thing I suppose I should mention is that another thing that drew me to his work, which is also quite related to my own academic interests, is that he writes a lot about the problems of language in Tibetan literature, or he reflects that in his writing, which is something that very few other writers, perhaps even no other writers, really do. He really shows the impact of the Chinese language on contemporary Tibetan society. And so a lot of his stories feature Chinese loanwords or linguistic misunderstandings, lost in translation kind of jokes, which to some extent require a knowledge or an understanding of Chinese to appreciate. And so that was one of the biggest challenges of translating this book, trying to find a way to really get across to the English reader this aspect of the work, that these are characters who are sometimes removed from the world that they know and understand, and that world is the Tibetan world, and it's suddenly put into, in one story in particular, literally moved these nomads are relocated from their nomadic pastures into a town where they suddenly have to speak Chinese, which is a language they don't understand at all. And it results in all of these hilarious but also tragic situations. And so that was definitely one of the most fun and challenging parts of translating this work. And overall, there isn't a lot of modern Tibetan literature that's been translated into English. And that's something that's started to change, especially in the last couple of years. There are more and more things coming out. And so I really hope that this book can make a big contribution to that and really help to get Tsering Döndrup and Tibetan literature in general the recognition with English language readers that I really think it deserves.